Hello, everybody. Welcome to another webinar that Skarn is hosting. I am Sophie Chung, CEO of Skarn, and today we have a very special guest with us, Russell Blades. We'll be playing a recording of our conversation, and we'll be here with you at the end to answer any questions. So please use the chat function in the webinar window and send us questions as they come. So without further ado, here it is, and see you on the other side. Hello and welcome to the webinar. I am Sophie Chung, CEO of Skarn, and today we have a very special guest with us. Welcome, Russ. Thanks for joining us. So Russ is a trusted independent advisor in the mining industry, particularly on renewable energy sources, and his prior posts include Director of Energy and Climate Change with Barrick, and he's also the past chairman of ICMM's Climate Change Committee. And Russ brings over 40 years of technical and managerial experience to this conversation in helping mining companies decarbonize. So thanks for joining us. And to set the scene, I'm going to present an overview of the decarbonisation targets that various companies have committed to. And this slide is packed with information, but the main point that I want to make is that there is increasing pressure for companies to have clear targets, both interim and for net zero, and that many of the decarbonisation targets, many of the interim targets are set for 2030 and 2035. I could spend ages talking about this slide, but I'm not going to, because the point that I want to make in this webinar is the importance of renewable energy sources and in the company's ability to meet those interim targets. And so here, what I show is for a selection of these companies, I'm showing you the key levers that each of the companies are pulling for their interim decarbonisation roadmap. And without any surprise that the renewable energy sources, their contribution is typically greater than 50% of the interim target roadmap. And there are a few exceptions, of course, but when I talk about renewable energy sources, I'm including the renewable PPAs, and so that's renewable electricity purchased through third parties, and that can be direct, sleeved, or even virtual, so not even connected to the grid that the mine site's tapping into. And then there's also the renewable capacities that mines are building on site, and many of several of these companies, for them, that is one of the main levers that they're pulling. Now, there seems to be a lot of progress, a lot of activity, but Russ, I kind of wanted to go back to a point that you made in one of our previous conversations, and you sort of elaborated on this notion that within the mining companies, there's this school of thought that if you wait a few years, it'll be cheaper, it will be easier, let's just kick it down the line. Shall we unpack that a little bit, because that's really interesting?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me on board. Exactly, it's like people, a lot of the senior management team, when they are asked about renewables, they're saying, well, the cost of solar is going down, the cost of wind is going down, why don't we just wait? And unfortunately, it never gets done, because also with waiting, and even though costs do come down, you still have to deal with issues like life of mine and your return on investment, hurdle rates, those types of things. So it's really important that at some point in time you kind of put a stake in the ground and say, let's move forward and let's do this.
Could you provide a little bit of color on the kind of competition within mining companies, for that same pot of investment, essentially, when it comes to looking at renewable energy projects?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great point. If you look at most mining companies, there is this competition for capital. And, when I was at Barrick, for example, that was always an issue. There's only so much funding available. Typically within the mining industry, I found that, typical hurdle rates are about 15% IRR. Sometimes those get adjusted based on the political situation in that particular country. So sometimes there's some risk adjustment to those IRRs. but that's kind of what you're competing with. And so, it can be difficult, even though, renewables, everyone kind of wants to do that. A lot of investors are pushing for it. There's this reality, there's this financial reality that the mines have to deal with, that they have to be good stewards of their money. And so they're looking at places where they get the best kind of returns for their investors.
Is that where the third party providers come in? Because I remember you talking about the hurdle rates and how that can be different.
Yeah, that's what we're seeing actually in the marketplace is a lot of mines are going to third parties, independent power producers who operate under a different model. First of all, a lot of times their hurdle rates are much less than miners. And secondly, that's what their business. So they'll go in, install the solar plant or wind farm or whatever it happens to be, and then operate under a PPA. But again, one of the things that's always going to be important is going to be, I guess, a couple things. First of all, they also look at the life of mine because they have to have a certain amortization period in order to recover their investments. And secondly, unfortunately, most renewables don't provide a 24/7 solution. And so mines or the independent power producer has to come up with other ways of providing the power when the sun doesn't shine or the wind doesn't blow. And that's often, the traditional diesel gensets that exist at mining companies.
And I think that, managing that risk is so crucial, isn't it, for mine operations, because they keep going 24/7. And let's unpack that a little bit, because through the research that we do at Skarn, we've had some interesting stories, like, one of the lithium mines in Australia where they managed to connect to the grid, hoping for, both lower carbon electricity, but more reliable electricity, or so they thought. And actually they're finding that there's plenty of disruption coming from the grid, and so now they're back to square one, rethinking that. But let's unpack that, notion of risk. And is renewable electricity always more risky in terms of secure supply? Because I can think of plenty of examples, especially the remote operations that are reliant on HFO or diesel. I think when we spoke about some examples there, it's not so black and white, is it?
No, you have to look at the whole supply chain. Like, how do you get the diesel to the site? And given the remote location of mines and how weather can impact it, most mines are prudent. They do have so many days of storage on site, but if you have a weather event where you have a huge snowfall and you're up in the mountains and the diesel trucks can't get to the site, now what do you do? And you also mentioned, things like transmission. I'm dealing with a lot of mines in Africa right now that, even though they're connected to the grid, as you mentioned, they're having brownouts. And so they're still having to rely on diesel. Or now I'm even seeing that a lot of the utilities are saying, okay, if you want to connect to us, you have to finance the transmission line. So, it becomes expensive. And even though, so those are those costs, but you still don't know if the generation is going to be there when you need it. We had a mine in Zambia, for example, that was low cost. We were paying roughly originally like about 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity because it was hydro power. But after a couple seasons of drought, that renewable power was no longer available, and so it had to be supplemented by the utility with fossil fuels. And so the carbon intensity goes up and the cost goes up. So Even though you're dealing with utilities, there's issues there. And here in the United States, we have problems with how long it takes to get connected to the grid. And then you have issues with grid constraints. We just transmission capacity to move where the solar or the wind is to where the major load centers are. So again, utilities aren't always the answer to resolving some of these issues, although, for most investors and most senior management, that's kind of the thought that that's the safer way to go, is go connect with the utility and use their power.
And so Russ, these are, some of the difficulties and the challenges that the industry has or is experiencing in its transition. But what about some of the more positive success stories? Can we shed any light on that? And what are the learnings from that we could share with our audience today?
Yeah, I think that it's not all doom and gloom, that's for sure. I mean, we're seeing mining companies moving forward and doing things. And, a lot of what's also driving it is this move towards electrification of mining, whether that's in material movement or whether that's in processes. And so a natural progression from that is, okay, if you're connected to the grid and you move from diesel trucks to electric rail or conveyors, which are much more efficient, you will reduce, your carbon footprint, but you're still at the mercy of what the carbon footprint is of the electric utility. And so we're seeing mines that are now saying, okay, let's start there, but let's move forward with putting on-site renewable generation. So because now we're dealing with a much smaller load, and we can now incorporate renewables into that, take advantage of things like regeneration, taking advantage of battery storage, and so forth, to help that mine get to that net zero situation. So that's where I'm seeing. But also some mines are being bold, and I know at Barrick, we put a 2 megawatts wind farm at one of our sites, and it was like at 4,000 meters. So there was logistics getting it to the site, but that's kind of what they wanted to do. They wanted to show that it can be done. And wanted to kind of be leaders. It's funny in the mining industry, I have this saying, and I think others do it as well. In the mining industry, everyone wants to be first to be second. No one wants to be the guinea pig and do things. They're all waiting for someone else in the mining industry to do it first before they start implementing those kinds of technologies, whether it's renewables or whether it's a new mining process. It's that's kind of the inherent attitude of the mining industry, at least based on my experience. But to decarbonize the mines, I think that mines need more push from government, from investors, and they need the incentives to do that. And I think, unfortunately, it needs to be kind of, as I said, a carrot and stick. They need to feel the pain of the price of carbon, but there also has to be some incentives out there. And whether it's incentives or whether it's access to low-cost capital, I think all those things are going to be helpful, helping the mining industry decarbonize.
And so, to close off, if you had a magic wand, what do you think you'd change about the mining industry and its current approach to decarbonisation?
Yeah, great question. I think when you look at the mining industry, to be honest, you have to look at the various phases of mining. So if you look at mining, it really is a three-phase operation. You've got the development phase, you have the operational phase, and then you have the closure phase. And I think to answer your question, there's different things that need to happen at each of those different stages. So let's start with the development stage. A lot of the audience will be familiar with some of the technical and pre-feasibility studies that are done in the mining industry. A good example is NI 43-101. But if you look at those types of reports that, that talk about mining operations, they talk about reserves, they talk about all those kind of technical issues, there really isn't a section on mine decarbonization. There's a little bit in the infrastructure on power, and there's kind of a afterthought line that says, we'll kind of look at renewable power and so forth. But until that becomes a major or mandated item within those types of studies, those pre-feasibility studies, it's going to be difficult for mines to take a real serious look and implement renewables for both power and for thermal needs. In fact, unfortunately, in the mining industry, you're almost penalized if you kind of stray from traditional protocols with mining, and whether that's in processing technology or in power or heating technology. And so to me, that's where one of the first things that need to change. There needs to be some kind of mandate where decarbonization is part of the process, that it's included in those types of reports, and there is some real engineering and thought that goes into how do we decarbonize the mine, and that obviously includes things like renewables, that includes things like, material movement, electrification, and then things like thermal processes as well. So that's how I would address the kind of the development stage of mining. In terms of operational stage, I think you need an environment where you have technology, innovation, and incentive together to provide 24/7 of reliable, low-cost, competitive power to the grid. That is definitely going to move things forward for mining, because most concerns, a lot of miners have concerns about renewables not being 24/7. And so if you can move technology and innovation, and there becomes incentives where you have reliable, low-cost power 24/7 to the mine, that's going to be really beneficial. And I think that also helps, when in the development stage, as I talked about before, if in the development, that there's this kind of structure or environment available to you once the mine is built. And then lastly, on closure, I think there needs to be some kind of incentives for mines to take those existing liabilities in most cases and take advantage of their location, their topography, their infrastructure. A lot of them already have roads. A lot of them already have substations, transformers, switchgear. A lot of them have very large pits at different elevations, so you can take advantage of energy storage or pumped hydro storage. I think having incentives that allow the mine to continue as a different kind of entity. Now it's kind of a power entity, which also helps to preserve some jobs. I mean, it's really difficult for communities when a mine closes. There's a lot of lost jobs. And I think if mines can be utilized for renewables and still keep some people employed, I think that's helpful. Now, obviously, you're still going to have some issues with possibly interconnection and queue issues. I in the U.S., I think there's like 2,000 gigawatts of proposed capacity.
Mm.
Just, it's crazy. It's multitudes of what the demand is, and wait times are like 3 to 5 years. So obviously that needs to be addressed as well. But I think if there's more incentives for mines to take their sites that are closing and to convert those to renewable energy assets, I think that would be helpful as well. So that's kind of the whole mine cycle, and little different answers, some kind of similar answers throughout that process. But I think that's what's important. We tend to think of mines mainly in their operational stage, but we forget that there's this whole development and closure that needs to be thought of as well.
Mm. Yeah, and I remain pretty optimistic in that I think we'll see some changes, in the next 5 years in terms of how business is done. I was speaking to a client in the financial sector, and I said to them, look, is sustainability is it ever going to be more than just a box ticking exercise? And they said, well, yeah, and they said that actually within our firm we treat net zero as seriously as zero fatality, and they were pretty serious about it. They said they've got their own emission targets to manage as a bank, and so they're increasingly looking at their portfolios and to see, where are the best performers, who's genuinely low carbon. And so I think it's taken some time, but I do expect that I think in the next few years, all the indications we have at Skarn through our conversations is that there will be change in how business is done. And I think that that's the other part of the equation, that miners alone being really proactive. I mean, as you said, it's a combination of reward and also penalization, and I think that will be coming in the next few years. So it's a space to watch here. So thanks so much for the discussion, Russ, and I think we open it up to questions. Just as a reminder, you can use the chat function in the webinar to type in any comments or thoughts you have that you would like us to address. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks everybody for staying with us, and let's open it up to questions. I see a question coming in about renewable heat and thermal applications. Ross, I think you and I have touched on that before. Do you want to expand on that?
Great question, by the way. Yeah, normally when we think of renewables, we tend to think of just power, and we forget that mines also have thermal needs as well. So what I mean by that is a lot of mines will have things like concentrate dryers, or they'll have roasters, or they'll have calciners like lime kilns and so forth. So they can represent up to like 20% of your energy requirements as well as your greenhouse gas emissions. And because of the fact that they typically need high temperatures, anywhere between 250 degrees C to 1,000 degrees C or more, fossil fuels has been typically the way of addressing that. And so that means, your natural gas, your diesel, your HFO, whatever it happens to be. So we know that those can be expensive and also big greenhouse gas emitters. What we're seeing in the marketplace is with things like solar, especially CSP, that can produce those high temperatures, along with thermal storage, and more along the lines of using like ceramic beads and stuff to store the heat. You can start addressing those types of big energy users and greenhouse gas emitters as well. And as a former director of energy climate change at Barrick, I mean, decarbonizing thermal processes is really the biggest challenge that I had at Barrick. I mean, we were moving towards electrification and those types of things, and renewables with solar and wind, but the heating is something that's often missed, and I think it's something that needs to be addressed. And fortunately for us, there's technologies out there that can help us address those things.
And I guess that would include, for example, I know I'm from Skarn's research, I'm aware of certain operations like leach operations where if they can use the renewable energy to heat up the electrolytes, they get better recovery. And I guess it's like projects like that as well.
You're actually touching on an interesting aspect that of renewables that people often forget. I mean, we normally look at renewables as a way to reduce typically power costs and reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But if you have low cost heat available, like you were mentioning, processes like heap leach heating, for example, or electrolyte heating, an electrowinning process, can actually help to increase your revenues. And most mines haven't really thought about heap leach heating because if you have a heap leach, whether it's copper, silver, gold, zinc, or even uranium, you're in a remote location, you tend to have your only option is things like diesel, and if diesel's $1 a liter, that's, $26 a gigajoule. That gets very expensive. And so most mines haven't really thought about taking advantage of things like heap leaching, taking advantage of the increased chemical kinetics, improvements with viscosity, improvements with surface tension that translates into increased recoveries of those metals. And so people don't even, because of that inherent past concern, you don't see mines doing column testing and seeing, okay, what if I were to heat the solution? What kind of better recoveries do I get? And then, that helps you then determine at what price per gigajoule does it make economic sense for renewable heat. So, it's kind of an interesting situation where, as I said, most times we think of renewables as a way of reducing costs or greenhouse gas emissions. But I think there's this whole new opportunity that allows a mine to actually increase production. So obviously, increase their profitability by increasing production and reducing operating costs.
Thanks for elaborating on that. I've got another question. So it says, can you give us a sense on the state of electrification in the mining sector right now? Is the push on heavy equipment and big haul trucks still happening? So from Skarn's side, we're hearing down the grapevines that there's sort of delays to that. But don't quote me on that because it's not a direct source. I think in the sustainability reports in the past few years coming out, I think the general sort of hint was that we'll start to see impacts from mine fleet electrification, say, 2030 and onwards. But I think there is sort of chat in the industry that might be pushed back, and that's coming from the OEMs. But Russ, I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, that brings up some things we've probably already discussed in terms of, wanting to be first to be second, and so forth. But we're seeing mines that are definitely starting to look at it, especially in underground mines. There are a lot of miners that are, starting to push forward. Some have already done it. Some have looked at putting electric rail in, or they're moving towards conveyors. I mean, the thing is, from an energy perspective, if you look at diesel trucks from an efficiency standpoint, you're like, roughly 0.45 kilowatt hours per ton kilometer. That's kind of how material movement is evaluated. And then if you look at things like, a lot of people are looking at diesel electric, that drops you down to about 0.38, but electric rail is like 0.03 and conveyors are like 0.05. So from an energy standpoint, it makes sense. But then there's also all these other, it's interesting because we did some studies on it, and I'm sure others in the audience have done it. And as you start to look at it, it's the domino effect of that in terms of how that impacts your roads, how that impacts dust, how that impacts the size of your maintenance yards, how that impacts the technical people that you need, and how many spares, and all those types of things. So it's an interesting exercise in terms of why it makes sense for the industry. Again, especially in developing mines, as I mentioned before, a lot of them are afraid to put that kind of technology out there because investors, want to see it more applied throughout the industry before they see it in developing new mines. So look, I think there's mines out there who are obviously looking at doing it. I think if there was more incentives out there, I think if we can get some of the major suppliers, because for some of them it may be a little bit threatening, although we are seeing some of the bigger guys looking at, as I said, diesel electric or battery electric vehicles. So it is moving. Just like anything else in the mining industry, it's a big ship, and often it takes time to change what has been the same way for many, many years.
Mm. And I think sort of adding to that, I was remembering a particular conversation I had, and it was that, listen, if you want to put in trolley assist lines in an existing pit, and if you're doing it on an existing ramp that's in use, then there's time that you have to take that ramp out of action, essentially, to do that installation, and then that has a knock-on effect on your NPV. And so that's another sort of challenge. And so and then on the other side, actually, some of the companies that are being more, I suppose, what's the right word, more innovative in a way, are sort of established producers, not necessarily the larger ones, but the ones that are bringing on new projects online. And then you do have a clean slate on that. And even with that, there's that hesitancy. And we've heard that from multiple sources to say, well, like, if I go, full on embracing this trolley assist electric technology, then am I actually going to get penalized for it because the banks don't really fully understand it? The technology is still maturing. So there's a lot of concern. So I think that it is happening, but it's in smaller steps perhaps than we might have thought. And I think that a lot of pilot testing is happening at the more established mines, and that's absolutely key because you need to test the technology and get feedback and improve it. But maybe actually because of the issues of installing those technology at existing mines, is that where you might to see that come in first to have effect is actually at the new projects that are coming online, where you have more flexibility to design it how you want it from the beginning.
And I think there has to be more collaboration with the mining industry. A lot of times mines kind of run independent, their own independent studies. And so they're taking on all the risk and all the capital and so forth. I'm starting to see this happen where the mining industry is becoming more collaborative because it is a common problem. And we've seen this before with other things where they came together to kind of solve a common problem.
Yeah. So I know we've run over, but there's a really good question that's coming, and I can't not share it, so I'm going to do it. So it says, isn't market-based scope to just fictitious accounting? Should it be an accepted lever in companies' decarbonisation roadmap? And it's kind of funny because I was having a debate with our head of research about this earlier today. I think there are some pretty strong views out there, and in fact, I did hear one financial institution say it's accounting. We actually strip out all scope to reductions that's linked to market PPA. And I kind of had a chat with them and said, but this black and white doesn't actually help anyone, because a lot of the decarb targets out there, the interim targets, a lot of that hangs off of the renewable electricity. And as we mentioned, a lot of those are renewable PPAs. And I think that concern, once again, it's coming from a lack of clarity or a lack of understanding. And it's to do with, is it truly, I think it's what's the phrase, credibly claimed? Can you prove that it's genuinely additional capacity, and that capacity wouldn't have come online if it wasn't for the mine that's sponsoring it, essentially, or underwriting it? And so I had this really extended chat with the bank about saying, well, actually, I think it's about bringing more clarity to that, because if you look at some roadmaps, then yeah, sure, some of them's right off, like we're just purchasing credits from a grid that we're not even connected to. Quite a few assets doing that, all the way to we're just taking it off the grid, but the actual generation capacity, it is being built, but it's miles away, and it's all packaged up into portfolios essentially. But then you do get the mines and the projects where it is a more direct relationship. So Anglo American's JV with Envusa Energy, that's an example. First Quantum's doing a similar thing with a utility provider in Zambia, and there are several examples in Australia where, even though the renewable power is purchased at an arm's length from a third party, that it is a very direct connection to the mine. And so I think the short answer to that is that we understand why there's concerns around using just market-based, and it is right. You should be vigilant about making sure that it's legitimate and that you can claim it. But at Skarn, I think we also believe that there's a lot of gray, and if you make it only black and white, then it's going back to your point, isn't it, Russ, that you have to have enough carrot and enough stick, and if you make it all stick, there'll be no change. So that's my 2 cents on it. But yeah, Russ, I don't know if you've got anything you want to add to that.
I mean, you've hit a lot of the good point, and that's why, I mean, if you have behind the meter, it obviously makes it a lot easier in terms of, how much of your energy is actually renewable and stuff. But that's something that I've heard debated quite a lot. So I think that's something that's probably worth for another seminar. But no, it's an interesting point that comes up quite a bit with investors and banks and so forth.
Yeah. Okay, well, in the interest of time, we'd better wrap it up. Like you said, we could just keep chatting for ages, but maybe we'll do a second round one day. I'm just going to share my screen quickly, see if I can figure out how to do that. And that's just to say, here it is. Here's that page. So thank you everybody for attending today's session. And today we had Russell Blades with us, and we've got contact details that we can share with you. So if you've got any follow-up questions, please do get in touch, and we'll also make these slides available as well for anyone who wants a copy. And just to close off, we will be at LME Week in London, and we're hosting 2 very interesting panel discussions, one on GHG and one on water. And on the topic of GHG, we're going to debate how much of the decarbonisation is just political pinball, or are we actually making progress? And the scope to element of it is going to come into that. So if you want to hear more about that, please come to our event. It's live, but it's also a virtual streaming event as well. So please check out our website and make sure that you register. So let's close it up there. Thank you again, Russ. Thank you everybody for your time, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, Sophie. Thanks everyone for joining.